I remember the first time I went to Gilgo Beach. It was the off-season, cloudy, cold, and strangely quiet. It's the kind of quiet that gets under your skin. The parking lot was nearly empty. It's just the wind, the waves, and the occasional seagull. But even then, before I ever knew the full story, something about the place felt wrong. Not just eerie, not just abandoned, tainted. It's like the ground itself had soaked up something it shouldn't have. At the time, I was just curious. A local, someone who'd grown up hearing whispers about those murders by the beach. People didn't talk about them much. Not in public, anyway. It was more like something you heard late at night, after a few drinks, when the conversation turned dark. A girl would go missing, then another. And before anyone really understood what was happening, the count was rising, silent, unstoppable, hidden in the sand. What started all of this wasn't even a murder. Technically, it was a missing persons report. Her name was Shannon Gilbert, 23 years old. From Jersey City, she worked as an escort, booking her clients through Craigslist. On May 1st, 2010, she went out to Oak Beach, a private, gated community on the south shore of Long Island, to meet a client. She never came home now. Women going missing in this business, sadly, it happens more often than people like to admit. But this case was different. Shannon had called 911. She said she was being chased. She ran from house to house in a panic, begging for help, screaming that someone was after her. But no one did much. The response was slow, dismissive. Some thought she was just on drugs. Others thought it was a mental breakdown. And then she vanished into the marsh. Gone. Her family pushed hard for an investigation, but months passed. No. Shannon, no answers. It was like the earth had swallowed her up, finally. In December 2010, 7 months after she disappeared, the police went back out to search the brush near Ocean Parkway, not far from where she'd last been seen. The hope was to find her, maybe even just some trace, a shoe, a phone, anything. But what they found instead changed everything. About a quarter mile from where the search began, tucked into the thick reeds and sand, officers came across a set of human remains. The body had been wrapped in burlap, like a package meant to be hidden. It wasn't Shannon, it was someone else entirely. A young woman, decomposed, forgotten. They called for backup, brought in more dogs, started combing the area more carefully. A few days later, another body, then a third, then a fourth. For women, all found within 500 feet of each other. All buried the same way, dumped in the same brush, wrapped in the same coarse burlap sacks. And all of them had one thing in common. They were all young women who'd worked as escorts, just like Shannon. The police realized quickly this wasn't random. It was calculated cold. These women hadn't just died, they'd been disposed of, lined up like trash, left in the weeds along the highway for no one to see, until now. Suddenly, the sleepy stretch of road leading to Gilgo Beach, a quiet, scenic route with views of the ocean on one side and marshland on the other, had become the center of one of the most horrifying mysteries in New York's history. At first, the media dubbed it the Gilgo 4. The press descended. Reporters camped out near the dunes. Helicopters flew overhead. Everyone was asking the same question. Who did this? And just as importantly, how long had he been doing it? The thing is, I'd driven down Ocean Parkway so many times before all of this. It's a road you take to escape the city for a bit. People fish there, picnic, walk their dogs. You'd never guess what was hidden, just feet from where the grass ends and the sand begins. But the killer had guessed. He knew. He must have known that hardly anyone walked that part of the road, that the brush was thick and untouched, that if you wrapped a body in burlap and placed it just far enough off the shoulder, it could lie there for years without anyone noticing. And he was right. No one noticed. Not for a long, long time. What still haunts me about Gilgo Beach isn't just what happened there. It's how easily it was hidden. how the calm, quiet air could cover something so dark. How you could be standing on that sand, watching the waves roll in, and never know that just beyond the brush, someone's daughter was lying in the dirt, waiting to be found. The world was about to learn the truth about Gilgo Beach, but at the time, all we knew was that 4 women had been murdered, and whoever had done it was still out there, watching, waiting, and likely already planning who was next. I used to think missing persons reports were just that, reports, paperwork, a formality, something filed when someone disappeared, but always resolved eventually. A misunderstanding, a change of plans, a runaway who'd come back once they cooled off. But Shannon Gilbert's disappearance wasn't like that. From the beginning, it didn't sit right. Not with her family, not with the few neighbors who caught a glimpse of her that night, and not with me years later when I started digging into the timeline and trying to imagine it from her side. The night of May 1st, 2010, Shannon arrived at a secluded home in Oak Beach with her driver and bodyguard, a man named Michael Peck. She was there to meet a client, a man named Joseph Brewer, someone who had hired her through Craigslist. What exactly went wrong inside that house remains foggy even now. Brewer claimed Shannon started acting paranoid, that she said someone was trying to kill her, that she ran out into the night screaming. Michael, the driver, reportedly tried to calm her down, but she didn't trust him either. She ran. She ran from house to house, banging on doors, yelling for help. Multiple residents called 911 to report a frantic woman running through the community. But the most haunting piece, the one that still gives me chills, is Shannon's own 911 call. A 23-minute phone call to emergency services where she says, in a trembling voice, that someone is after her, that they're trying to kill her. The dispatcher tries to get more information, but she's disoriented, confused, afraid. At one point, she says, "They're trying to kill me," then goes silent for several seconds. You can hear her breathing. You can hear movement. She doesn't know where she is. She doesn't give a clear address, and that, more than anything, might have been what doomed her. Police didn't take the call seriously. Some suggested she was on drugs, hallucinating. Others dismissed it as a mental health crisis. She vanished into the marshlands behind the gated community, barefoot, her phone dropped somewhere in the chaos, and for months, nothing happened. The official explanation leaned toward accidental death. Maybe she got lost in the dark and drowned in the marsh. But Shannon's mother, Mari Gilbert, never believed that. She said her daughter was scared. For a reason, she pushed investigators, called the media, held rallies. She believed Shannon had seen something or someone she wasn't supposed to, and I believe she was right. Because 7 months later, when the Suffolk County Police returned to Oak Beach to search for Shannon, they brought with them K9 units and cadaver dogs. They weren't expecting much. Maybe a jacket, a shoe, her phone. But less than a mile west of where she vanished, along Ocean Parkway, one of the dogs signaled. Officers stepped into the brush, and there, partially buried in the sand, was the first body, wrapped in burlap, carefully placed. A few days later, a second body was found, then a third, then a fourth, all within the same quarter-mile stretch of road. All women, all young, all working as escorts. None of them were Shannon's. What made it even more horrifying, the police had gone searching for one woman and stumbled upon a mass grave of strangers. The remains were skeletal, decomposed, some dating back several years. Whoever did this had a routine, a method. He knew the landscape, knew how to time the disposal, and he was organized. There was no panic in how the bodies were placed, no sign of carelessness or rush. It was clinical, methodical, as if the killer had done it before and planned to do it again. I remember reading the reports when it first hit the news. The term serial killer wasn't used right away, but it didn't need to be. 4 women, all placed in nearly identical ways, in the same location over an unknown span of time. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a message. But to whom and for what reason, no one could say. The stretch of Ocean Parkway where the bodies were found is long and remote. On one side, a marshland. On the other, a narrow strip of sand dunes leading out to the water. It's the kind of place where you might pull over to take in the view, but you wouldn't walk deep into the brush. It's tangled, thick, and unforgiving. That's what made it perfect. The killer understood that. He used the natural geography like a cover. And what terrifies me now, thinking back, is that those women could have been lying there while thousands of cars passed just yards away. Families driving to the beach, couples watching the sunset. All unaware that less than 50 feet from the road, a graveyard was growing. The discovery of those 4 women, what the media started calling the Gilgo 4, should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. It was only the beginning. More searches were conducted. More remains were uncovered. Fragments, bones, partial skulls. Some found miles away from the first cluster. Some dismembered, matched to other missing persons. Cases from years earlier. The numbers grew, and the questions only got darker. Had someone been hunting women on Long Island for years? And how had no one noticed? As I sat at home, watching the news clips, reading the case files, I felt this creeping dread. It wasn't just about who the killer was. It was about how close he'd been all along. The killer had blended into the background, used the internet, used isolation, used society's disregard for certain women to move in silence. And now, the silence was cracking wide open. They called them the Gilgo 4. That phrase stuck in my mind like the chorus of a nightmare. For women, for bodies, 4 victims left in a row along a lonely stretch of Ocean Parkway, a desolate road most New Yorkers only take on their way to a beach day or to avoid traffic off the expressway. It seemed so ordinary, so forgettable. But in December of 2010, it became something else entirely, a makeshift graveyard, secret dumping ground. And the more we learned about the victims, the more it felt like someone had been doing this for a long, long time and getting away with it. The first body found during the search for Shannon Gilbert was identified as Melissa Barthelemy, 24 years old. From Buffalo, she'd moved to the Bronx, rented a basement apartment, and made money as an escort through Craigslist. Her last known contact was a client scheduled for July 12, 2009. After that, nothing. Just silence. Her phone went dead. Her bank account stopped moving. For almost a year and a half, she was just another missing person, her family begging for answers and hitting walls. But after Melissa's body was discovered, the floodgates opened. Just 2 days later, the second body was found. Maureen Brainerd Barnes, 25, from Connecticut. She'd been missing since 2007. She was the earliest of the 4 to vanish, but her case had gone cold almost immediately. She was the one that no one had linked to the others until her remains turned up in the sand next to them. Then came Megan Waterman, 22, from Maine. She had vanished in June 2010, just months before Shannon. She had a young daughter. Her family said she was working to provide for a little girl, using Craigslist to make money fast. She told her boyfriend she was heading out to meet a client in Hauppauge, Long Island, and she never came back. Her body was found the same way, wrapped in burlap, hidden in the brush, lined up like the others. The 4th was Amber Lynn Costello, just 27, from North Babylon, New York. She was last seen in September 2010. Her story was tragically familiar, working online, meeting clients through Craigslist, trying to survive. Witnesses later said they saw her leaving her home with a man that night, someone she thought was just another client. She left her cell phone behind. It was supposed to be a short call. She never returned, and just like the others, her final resting place was along Ocean Parkway. beneath the same windswept brush, blanketed in the same burlap wrapping. What stuck with me was the symmetry, the order, the way the bodies had been placed, evenly spaced, side by side. It didn't feel chaotic. It didn't feel impulsive. It felt ritualistic, controlled. Whoever did this didn't panic. He wasn't worried about being seen. He'd chosen that stretch of road for a reason. The remoteness, the thick brush, the lack of cameras or homes. He knew how long it would take for someone to notice, or, in this case, not notice. Okay, and he was right. If Shannon Gilbert hadn't gone missing and triggered a search, those bodies might still be out there now, slowly breaking down in the cold earth. Nothing more than missing persons posters and unanswered voicemails. It was terrifying to realize how easily these women had vanished, how completely. No one came looking, not at first. Not loudly, not publicly. Their families tried, yes, but the media didn't care. Law enforcement shrugged, handed more than anything is what the killer exploited. He picked women who could disappear quietly. Women no one would panic over. Craigslist, escorts, runaways, single moms, women on the edge. And in that invisibility, he found the perfect cover. But now, with 4 bodies discovered back to back, the illusion shattered. The press finally caught on. And when they did, the headlines exploded. Long Island serial killer feared. Bodies found near beach. Killer stalks Craigslist. The public reaction was instant, and yet strangely muted. People were horrified, yes, but also detached. Maybe because the victims were sex workers. Maybe because they weren't local girls with high-profile careers or smiling senior yearbook photos. Maybe because people still couldn't accept that something like this could happen in a place so familiar. I remember standing near the area where they were found. Not right on the scene, of course, but close enough. The wind off the water was sharp that day, cold and salty. You could smell the ocean, hear it in the distance, and yet all I could focus on was the idea of those 4 women, laid out one after the other, hidden in plain sight for years. That kind of thing doesn't just happen. It takes time, planning, repetition. I remember looking over the barricade and wondering, did he come at night? Did he drive slowly down the road, headlights off, body in the trunk, waiting for just the right pull-off? Did he listen to music? Did he feel anything? Was it just routine by that point? The same process, the same result. It's over and over again. The discovery of the Gilgo 4 wasn't the end. It wasn't the shocking finale of a serial killer's story. It was the prologue, the first chapter. And it told us 2 things very clearly. 1, someone had been murdering women on Long Island for years. 2, that someone wasn't done yet. We talk about serial killers like they're legends, like they're characters in a movie. We give them names, titles even. The Long Island serial killer, the Craigslist ripper, Lisk. We build stories around the mystery of who they are, how they got away with it, what clues they left behind. But we rarely talk about the people they took. We forget their names first, then we forget their faces, and eventually we just group them together as a number for victims. 10 victims, maybe more. It's easy to focus on the killer because he's faceless, unknown, and terrifying. But the truth is, the most important stories are the ones that ended too soon. And I can't talk about this case without talking about them. Melissa, Maureen, Megan, and Amber, not just as remains found in the brush, but as people, daughters, sisters, friends, survivors, up until the very moment they couldn't be anymore. Melissa Barthélemy was born in Buffalo, New York. She was small, with dyed blonde hair and a quiet smile. People who knew her said she was funny, sarcastic, a little shy, but smart. She left home young, like a lot of girls do when they're trying to get out of a rough situation. Moved to New York City and tried to make it. For a while, she worked as a hairdresser. Then she started escorting. She never told her family the full truth about what she was doing. It's hard to blame her. When she vanished in July 2009, her mother reported her missing, but it didn't make headlines. There were no TV interviews, no Amber Alerts. She just slipped off the radar. Her mother and sister kept calling her phone, hoping for something. And then the phone started calling them. Someone used Melissa's phone to call her teenage sister multiple times. The man on the other end said horrible things. He taunted her, told her Melissa was dead, that he had killed her, that he had done things to her body. Police traced the calls to Times Square, crowded, anonymous, impossible to follow. To this day, no one knows for sure if it was the killer calling, but whoever it was, they knew. They wanted the family to suffer. They enjoyed the pain, and that says a lot about who we were dealing with. Maureen Brainerd Barnes was the oldest of the four, 25, when she vanished. It's from Norwich, Connecticut. She had 2 kids. She'd worked at a telemarketing job, but had fallen behind on bills. When she started escorting through Craigslist, it wasn't a lifestyle choice. It was survival. She told friends it would just be temporary. One last job, a quick way to catch up. In July 2007, she took a bus to Manhattan for a couple of calls. She was supposed to come home 2 days later. She never did. Her last message to a friend said she was going to meet a client and would be back soon. That was it. She was gone. For years, no one connected her disappearance to the others. T was the earliest. Her case was cold by the time the bodies were found in 2010. But when her remains were identified, it added a chilling detail to the killer's timeline. He had been doing this for at least 3 years, possibly more. Megan Waterman was just 22, from Scarborough, Maine. She had a little girl, 3 years old. She loved being a mom. She posted happy pictures online and joked about her love for Dunkin' iced coffee. People who knew her said she had a big laugh and an even bigger heart. She'd started dating a man who introduced her to escorting. She didn't love the work, but it paid better than anything else. In June 2010, she traveled to Long Island with him for a few calls. She was last seen at the Holiday Inn in Halbach, leaving the hotel around 1:30 in the morning. Her family knew something was wrong right away. She never went more than a few hours without checking on her daughter. When she stopped responding, they reported her missing. She'd only been gone a few months when police found her body at Gilgo Beach. I think about her daughter sometimes. I wonder what she grew up hearing. What'd she be told? How'll she remember a mother who never came home? Amber Lynn Costello was the last of the 4 to vanish. She's 27, from North Babylon, Long Island, close to where she'd end up buried. She had battled addiction for years, but was trying to get clean. She lived with housemates, worked as an escort to pay for bills and survival. On September 2nd, 2010, she got a call from a client, someone she'd seen before. She left her phone behind and told her roommates she'd be right back. She never returned. Witnesses later described the man who picked her up, a white male, about 6 feet tall, driving a dark-colored pickup. Sound familiar? It would later. At the time, it was just another missing girl and a blurry story for women. 4 different paths, 4 different lives, but one thing in common: they were all invisible to the people who were supposed to protect them. I don't say that lightly. I've looked at the timeline. I've reviewed the police responses, the delays, the doubt, the way their jobs, sex work, turned every conversation into an uphill battle. It's one of the ugliest truths in this case. Scarily picked victims who the world already treated like they mattered less, and, in doing so, he guaranteed that his crimes would take longer to solve if they were solved at all. These women weren't disposable, okay? They were not just names on a list. They were people, okay? And it took years for their stories to be heard, okay? That's why I do this. That's why I keep coming back to Gilgo Beach, because for too long, the focus has been on the man who did this. But before there was a killer, There were lives, full ones, messy ones, beautiful ones. And when you walk along that stretch of road, past the whispering brush and the roaring waves, you don't hear silence. You feel the absence. It's the weight of what was lost. And if you listen close enough, you can almost hear them. Not crying, not screaming, not begging for justice, just existing. The way they should have been allowed to all along. You'd think finding 4 bodies in one place would be the end of it. A breaking point. A final, terrible reveal that would send a whole case into overdrive and demand action. But Gilgo Beach was not done giving up its dead. The deeper investigators went into the tangled marsh and thickets along Ocean Parkway. The more remains began to surface, and with every new discovery, the lines around this killer began to blur. It started in the spring of 2011, months after the Gilgo 4 had been found. The Suffolk County Police resumed their search, this time expanding beyond the original quarter-mile where the women had been buried. Their thinking was simple. If someone was using this area as a dump site, they probably hadn't limited themselves to one spot. They were right. On April 4th, 2011, police found 3 more sets of remains. One was later identified as Jessica Taylor, a woman who had gone missing in July of 2003. She was 20 years old. Her torso had actually been discovered years earlier in Manaville, nearly 45 miles away, but no one connected the dots at the time. Now, more of her remains, including her skull, had been found in the Gilgo brush. Just yards away, police discovered a second woman, later identified as Valerie Mack. Like Jessica, parts of her body had been found in Manaville years earlier. Her skull, hands, and other bones were now here, along Ocean Parkway. 2 women, both dismembered, both partially buried in a remote woodland years apart, and both now reunited in death with their own missing pieces. The killer hadn't just dumped bodies, he had split them up, placed pieces in entirely different parts of Long Island. That's not something an amateur does. That's something someone plans. A person with time, with storage, with confidence. And that was just the beginning. That same day, police found something that still makes my stomach turn. The remains of a toddler, a little girl estimated to be about 2 years old. She was wrapped in a blanket, her tiny body left near the same area. There were no clothes, no ID, no way to even guess at who she was until months later, and DNA testing revealed a horrifying detail. She was the child of one of the other victims, a woman whose remains were also found along the beach. They were killed together, mother and daughter, left in the same marshland to rot beneath the wind and the rain. On April 11th, another discovery, a man's remains. He was found in women's clothing, missing his head and hands. No one knows who he was, even now. Police speculated he might have been a cross-dresser or transgender woman. Kesa, the press called him Asian male doe. He had been killed violently, left discarded like the others. Then came another skull, another torso, another pair of hands. It's the remains of a woman dubbed Peaches, nicknamed after a peach tattoo found on the torso discovered in 1997 in Hempstead, Lake State Park. Her skull had now been found at Gilgo Beach. Alongside her, more heartbreak, the remains of a second child, believed to be hers. That makes 11 victims, at least. 11 lives erased, bones scattered across counties, some of them hidden for more than a decade. I remember reading the full list one night, alone in my apartment, sitting in the dark, with just the screen lighting up my face. One by one, the names and nicknames blurred together. Melissa, Maureen, Megan, Amber, Jessica, Valerie, Peaches, Baby Doe, Asian male, the unknown child. It was like staring into the abyss. And the deeper I looked, the more the case unraveled into something bigger than I ever imagined. Because, up until then, everyone believed they were looking for one killer, a single predator with a pattern. But now, things weren't so simple. Some victims were dismembered, some were whole, some were posed, others were dumped. The materials used, burlap, plastic bags, blankets, weren't consistent. Even the method of death seemed to vary. Some appeared strangled, others, no cause could be determined. Some bodies had been there for years, others, just months. It didn't add up, okay? And the investigators knew it, quietly, behind closed doors. They began entertaining a new possibility, one that chilled me to my core the first time I heard it. What if it wasn't just one killer? What if Gilgo Beach was the dumping ground for multiple predators, men who knew the area, who shared the same twisted taste for vulnerable victims, who operated in the shadows and used the marshland like a communal grave? The idea was horrifying, but it made a twisted kind of sense. One site, multiple killers, convergence of evil, all hidden behind a curtain of salt, air, and quiet waves. Even the timeline supported it. Jessica Taylor and Valerie Mack were both dismembered and dumped before the Gilgo 4. Different method, different disposal, same final destination. It was like someone had set the stage years before the main show began. But if there were multiple killers, the question became even more terrifying. How many, and why Long Island? Why that specific road, that specific patch of brush? I started to see Ocean Parkway differently after that, not just as a road, but as a kind of magnet, a place that drew darkness, a place that let predators feel invisible. When I drove it after dark, I couldn't stop staring into the trees, wondering how many secrets still lay just a few feet off the pavement, buried beneath the sand. I wasn't the only one. Reporters, investigators, even amateur sleuths started combing through every unsolved case from the last 30 years, looking for similarities. Craigslist murders, sex workers who went missing near the beach, dismembered torsos, cold cases in Manival. Some patterns emerged, some didn't. But no matter how hard we looked, there were no solid answers, only questions. The count had risen, but the truth hadn't come with it. And for the families of the victims, those who'd waited years just for recognition, the pain only deepened, because with every new discovery, the message became louder and clearer. No one had been watching. Not the police, not the government, not the media. These women had vanished without noise, without coverage, without anyone raising the alarm. And now, here they were, stacked and scattered, dug up by dogs and storm winds. Nothing left but bones and questions. Okay? That's what I think about most when I walk that beach now. Not just the killer, but the silence. The vast, yawning silence that let it all happen. That silence is more terrifying than any monster, because monsters you can name, monsters you can chase. But silence just lets them keep killing. You can blame the killer all you want, and believe me, I do, but there's another kind of horror in this story that no one wants to look too closely at, because the Gilgo Beach murders didn't just slip through the cracks. The cracks were wide open, okay? In fact, some of them were carved into the system by the very people who were supposed to protect us. By now, the case had ballooned into one of the biggest serial murder investigations in New York history. And yet, the Suffolk County Police Department was spiraling. Every time they stood in front of a microphone, they looked more and more lost. And worse, more defensive. You could feel it, that tension under their statements. That fear of being exposed, not just for failing, but for ignoring people. Especially the women, the victims. The ones who called them for help long before their bodies were found by the side of the road. Okay, people don't like to admit this, but we all knew something was off with the SCPD. The corruption wasn't new. Arrogance wasn't new. Fact, it had been rotting under the surface for years. But the Gilgo case brought it all to the surface. Hey, and at the center of it was one name we kept hearing over and over again. James Burke, chief of police at the time, a man who carried himself like a hammer and treated anyone who questioned him like a nail. He was known for being aggressive, dismissive, and terrifying to work under, and under his leadership, the investigation into the Long Island serial killer was practically locked down. Not in a productive way. Not in a "we're keeping this" airtight kind of way, but in a "don't ask too many questions" kind of way. Journalists were stonewalled. Federal agencies were kept at arm's length. And even inside the department, rumors swirled that leads were going cold simply because no one was willing to pursue them. But why? Why would anyone not want to solve a case like this? Why would a police chief push back against help from the FBI in the middle of a serial killer investigation? The answer came years later, and when it did, it shook the entire community. In 2016, Burke was sentenced to federal prison, not for anything directly related to the Gilgo case, but for beating a suspect who had stolen a duffel bag from his car, then orchestrating the cover-up with other officers. Duffel bag. It reportedly contained sex toys, porn, and other things a higher-ranking police chief wouldn't want made public. He was exposed, humiliated, and suddenly, all those years of obstruction started to make sense. The man leading the investigation had been more focused on protecting himself than solving the murders. He didn't want the FBI snooping around his department. He didn't want his own secrets exposed, so he kept everything close, including leads, documents, and timelines. He turned the case into a black box, and the killer used that darkness to keep operating. And while Burke was doing that, victims kept dying. Families kept begging for answers. And the rest of us, we started to realize just how broken everything was. It wasn't just about one bad cop. It was about the culture that let him thrive. The silence wasn't just in the marsh. It was in the hallways of precincts. It was in the email chains that went ignored, It was in the emergency calls that never got follow-ups, like the one Shannon Gilbert made on the night she vanished. Shannon, the young escort who had met a client in Oak Beach and fled the house. Screaming, she called 911 and said someone was trying to kill her. She ran barefoot into the night, knocking on doors, hiding in the brush, and then she was gone. Her body wouldn't be found for over a year, and when it was, police immediately said it wasn't homicide, that she must have died from misadventure. That phrase always haunted me. Misadventure, as if a young woman calling for help, running for her life, and ending up dead in a swamp was some kind of tragic fairy tale, as if she just stumbled into death on her own. No one responsible, no one at fault. But when her 911 call was finally released, after 10 years of legal battles, it told a different story. Long, panicked, confusing call in which Shannon begs for help, saying over and over again that they're trying to kill her. She sounds terrified. She sounds lucid, and the call lasts 22 minutes. 22 minutes of a young woman trying to survive. And somehow, despite that, the police still refused to classify her death as a murder. They said she was delusional, that she'd run off into the marsh in a panic and drowned. But how do you explain her clothes being found far from the body? How do you explain the injuries? How do you ignore her voice, screaming through a cell phone for help? The answer, again, is silence. A system that didn't see women like Shannon or Megan or Amber or Maureen or Melissa as victims worth protecting. They were labeled as sex workers and left out of the headlines for years. It's not polite to say, but it's true. Had these victims been wealthy, white college students from the suburbs, this case would have been national news the moment the first body was found. But they weren't. They were escorts. Some had drug issues. Some had criminal records. And in the eyes of too many, that meant their lives were worth less, disposable, erased. The killer knew that. That's why he picked them, and the system proved him right. Over and over again. The press didn't report their disappearances. The cops didn't follow up on tips. Even their families had to fight to be heard. I've spoken to those families, seen their pain, heard the way their voices shake when they talk about their daughters, their sisters, their moms. They say things like she was more than her job, and she had a big laugh, and she always came home for Thanksgiving. They talk about favorite songs and childhood pets, and the way the house feels different without her. And every time they speak, you can feel the weight of being ignored pressing down on them. 'Cause it wasn't just that their loved ones were murdered, it was that they were made to feel like they didn't matter, like their grief didn't count. That kind of pain doesn't go away. It lingers, it festers, okay? And it changes people. I think that's what changed me the most about this case, realizing how easy it is for people to fall through the cracks and how hard it is to crawl back out. The killer hid behind the trees, but the real damage was done in offices, T's, in police, departments, in silence. And when silence protects a monster, that silence becomes just as dangerous. That's what haunts me now when I look back. Not just the bodies, not just the beach, but the quiet, the long, dangerous, unbroken quiet that let it all happen and almost let it keep happening forever. The silence couldn't last forever, not with so many voices pressing up against it, clawing at the walls, refusing to be quiet anymore. It didn't happen all at once. It never does. But sometime around 2016, maybe a little before, the cracks started forming. They were small at first. A newspaper column here, blog post there, a family holding a vigil at the edge of Ocean Parkway, holding up signs with faces no one wanted to look at. But over time, those cracks got bigger, louder. In that darkness, the killer had been hiding and began to flicker with light. A local paper would run a story and people would share it. A podcaster would dig through case files and someone else would come forward. A former cop would retire and decide to say what they couldn't say before. Suddenly, what had once been a dead case, buried under politics, ego, and apathy, was being dragged back into the daylight, one painful inch at a time. And at the center of that change were the people who had lost the most, the families. They never gave up, not after being ignored, not after being lied to, not after being told over and over again that their daughters, sisters, mothers were just runaways or troubled girls who probably went off the grid. They kept showing up. Keed kept calling reporters. Keed putting up billboards. And eventually, the right people started listening. The press began to turn. National news outlets picked up the story. Documentaries were made. Podcasts like Unraveled and the Lisk podcast started pulling in listeners, not just curious strangers, but potential witnesses, former cops, even people from the neighborhoods around Gilgo Beach. People who had seen things, heard things, things they'd kept to themselves for years. Some were scared, some were ashamed, some thought what they knew didn't matter until someone finally told them it did. And that's the thing about truth. It can be buried, but it doesn't rot. It waits, it lingers, and eventually it demands to be heard. One of the biggest changes came when James Burke, the disgraced former police chief, finally went to prison. Once he was gone, the walls he'd built around the case began to collapse. The FBI was invited back in. Task forces were reassembled. People who'd been shut out were suddenly allowed back into the room. But even then, it wasn't easy. Case had been so badly mishandled that parts of it were a mess. Evidence had been lost. Timelines were jumbled. Some leads had gone cold forever. But still, there was hope. A slow, shaky, determined kind of hope. Detectives began re-interviewing people. Old tips were re-examined. The 911 call from Shannon Gilbert, which had been hidden for years, was finally released. And when people heard it, really heard it, the anger came rushing back, 'cause it was undeniable now. Her voice was scared, clear, desperate. She had been running for her life, and no one came. That call became a turning point. not just because of what it revealed, but because of what it represented, the human cost of being ignored, the way it felt to call for help and be met with silence. Journalists started asking tougher questions. Why had it taken so long? Why were the families treated the way they were? Why did the police department block the FBI? And behind closed doors, people in power began to feel the pressure. Elections were coming. New officials were taking office. And, unlike their predecessors, some of them actually wanted to fix things. A new Suffolk County police commissioner came in and reopened everything. He created a dedicated task force focused only on solving the Gilgo Beach murders. And for the first time in years, it actually felt like someone was trying. The media called it a reboot. Families called it a lifeline, tidging to the killer. Whoever they were, it must have felt like the walls were starting to close in, because for years, they'd moved to the shadows with no resistance. But now, those shadows were shrinking, slowly but surely, street by street, tip by tip. Technology had improved. DNA analysis was sharper. Cell phone tower data, once limited, could now be reinterpreted with newer tools. And just as important, the public was watching. People cared now. They remembered the victims' names. They knew the roads, the neighborhoods. They talked about it at grocery stores, at gas stations, in diners with cracked menus and coffee that never cooled. And for the first time in a decade, the name Gilgo Beach didn't just mean failure. It meant unfinished business. It meant justice that was still possible. I remembered that feeling, that quiet excitement when an article would drop saying new task force assembled or Suffolk County officials make promise to families. It didn't erase the pain. It didn't fix the damage, but it was movement. And when you've been stuck in grief for that long, any movement feels like oxygen. But there was something else I noticed, too. Something darker. The killer, or killers, depending on what you believed, had always been quiet. But now, they had a reason to go even quieter. We didn't know if they were still out there, still watching, but I've always believed they were. That they saw the press conferences, that they heard the podcasts, that they knew the game was changing. And the question I kept asking myself was this: what do you do when your hiding place isn't safe anymore? Do you stop? Do you panic? Or do you double down? I didn't know the answer back then, but I knew this: the chase was back on. And this time, the ones doing the chasing weren't going to back down. For years, the case had sat still, files stacked in boxes, evidence locked away in basement rooms, leads cold and forgotten. But around 2020, something shifted. A T didn't make headlines right away, but behind the scenes, something was finally moving, quietly, methodically, and with a new kind of focus. This wasn't just about reopening the old case files. This was about applying tools that didn't exist a decade earlier, because by now, DNA had changed. It wasn't just about matching blood at crime scenes or pulling hairs from clothing. It was about building trees, digital ones, from public genealogy data, from sites where millions of people had mailed away saliva samples to learn more about their ancestry. Investigators weren't just chasing a killer anymore. They were chasing families, genetic markers, shared history. And when that kind of science meets a case full of untouched evidence, strange things can start to happen. The Suffolk County Task Force, rebuilt and finally empowered, began retesting everything they had: bits of hair, skin cells, a pizza crust left in a trash can. And slowly, the pieces started to fall into place. Not all at once. It took time. Hours of comparing DNA strands, cross-referencing phone records from towers that once blinked silently near Ocean Parkway. Looking at old tips with new eyes. Even the burlap the bodies were wrapped in, once considered a dead-end clue, was re-examined with updated technology. And that's the thing, the killer probably thought they were careful. Maybe they were careful for a time, but to be even the smallest mistake, a crumb of DNA, a phone left on for too long, search typed into Google, can come back years later like a shadow with teeth. And in this case, it did. Investigators began narrowing the pool, first from thousands to hundreds, then dozens. Then one man started to stand out, a man named Rex Hoyerman, an architect from Massapequa Park, living just 30 minutes from where the bodies were found. On the outside, he looked like any other guy, middle-aged, lived in the same house for decades, commutes into Manhattan, no long criminal record. But underneath that, the signs were there. His phone records placed him near the crime scenes during the time the victims went missing. Burner phones had been traced 2 towers near both the beach and his home. Even more chilling, some of the calls made to the victims' families, taunting, cruel phone calls had pinged near his office in Midtown Manhattan. And then came the breakthrough. A piece of pizza thrown away in Manhattan in early 2023 was quietly collected by investigators. They tested the crust and it matched the DNA found on one of the victims' remains, specifically hair found on the burlap that wrapped Melissa Barthelemy. That was it. The silent thread that tied him to the beach. The trace he never meant to leave behind. And once they had that, the rest came fast. They found searches on his computers, disturbing ones. They found burner phones registered under fake names but connected to his main phone through shared locations. They found records of him looking up news about the investigation over the years, not just curious glances, obsessive searches. Dozens and dozens of them, okay? And all the while, he had been living in plain sight, working, going to bars, shopping for groceries, walking past neighbors who never suspected a thing. Adena, if you ask me, I think he knew the end was coming. With a pow, like that, they watch everything. They feel when the world is shifting. I bet he felt it in the way the news stories got closer. I bet he saw his own face in the mirror and wondered when the knock would come. And when it did, July 13th, 2023, it came loud. FBI agents, local detectives, crime scene vans tore through it and brought him in. He didn't resist, didn't make a scene. It's just like that. The man who may have haunted Gilgo Beach for over a decade was in custody. Okay, but it wasn't over. Because as the evidence was revealed, as the charges were read out, it became clear this might only be part of the story. He was charged with the murders of Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, Amber Costello, and later Maureen Brainerd Barnes. All 4 were part of what had become known as the Gilgo 4. But there were more bodies found out there, more names, more pain. And while some believe he's tied to all of them, others think it's not that simple. Could it be that more? Then one killer used that beach, dead. Someone else is still out there, watching from the shadows as Rex took the fall. The truth is, we don't know yet, only just beginning to pull the threads. His trial is still ahead, his secrets still locked inside his home, his search history, his memories. But what we do know is this: the silence is gone now. The mystery that held Long Island in its grip for over 10 years has started to speak. And it all began with a slice of pizza in a trash can, a trace the killer thought he left behind in the dark. But that science and time brought screaming into the light. The arrest shocked the world, but what followed was even more disturbing. Because the man neighbors had known as a quiet, if slightly awkward, architect turned out to be living a life darker than anyone had imagined. As police peeled back the layers of Rex Hoyerman's life, starting with his Long Island home, they realized quickly that his mask of normalcy was just that, a mask, and a fragile one at that. The house itself, the one he lived in since childhood, was almost frozen in time, the paint chipped, the curtains drawn. It wasn't the home of a successful professional, not the house of a man who worked in Manhattan's bustling architecture world. It was a place that felt stuck, like something had grown old inside and never changed. Investigators found hundreds of weapons inside, legal mostly, but still alarming in scale. Guns lined the walls, tucked into closets, stored in safes. But it was what they found in the digital realm that was worse. Its computer records painted a picture of obsession. Dozens of burner phones used to communicate with sex workers, with some traced back to the exact windows of time when women, like Amber Costello and Megan Waterman, disappeared. But there were also searches, endless ones. Searches about the Gilgo Beach case, about the victims, about the investigation timeline, about police movements. And, perhaps most chilling of all, searches for disturbing content involving violence, control, and dominance, all centered on women. He wasn't just someone who stumbled into darkness. It seemed like he studied it, day after day. It raised the question that's haunted investigators and survivors alike. Was Rex Heuermann always like this? Was he born with this darkness, or did it grow over time in secret, feeding on the parts of life no one ever saw? Because from the outside, he did what so many killers have done before. He blended in. He was a family man, had a wife, 2 kids. He went to work every day. He made small talk with neighbors. He took the train into the city. But even his family life now seemed like part of the performance. His wife was reportedly out of town during each of the suspected murders, a detail that made some investigators wonder whether her absences were used as opportunities, whether, somewhere deep down, Rex had built his whole routine around the ability to slip away and come back unnoticed. The more investigators learned, the more disturbing the picture became, because his crimes weren't messy outbursts or chaotic accidents. They were cold, calculated, and repetitive. The use of burner phones, the selection of victims from vulnerable communities, the way the bodies were left, wrapped in burlap, lined along a stretch of road that he likely passed often, and always, the ability to vanish again into the quiet of his everyday life. There's something about that kind of hidden predator that makes it worse. Someone who walks among people, who stands in line at coffee shops, who holds a job, files taxes, waves to the mailman, all while carrying a secret that could shatter lives. One investigator described his home as a vault of secrets. They're still going through the evidence, computers, hard drives, handwritten notes, trying to map out what was real and what was fantasy, trying to separate his lies from the cold facts. And even now, there's a chance we don't know the full extent of what he did. There may be victims we haven't found, clues no one has recognized yet. The Long Island coastline holds years of mystery, and not every piece has surfaced. The most disturbing part: it wasn't some isolated house in the woods. It wasn't a cabin in the hills. It was just a small, rundown home on a quiet street, surrounded by families and children and neighbors who thought they knew him. And maybe that's the part that stays with people the most, the reminder that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like the man next door who never quite smiled right, the one who never had guests, the one who always left his lights off, the one who, in hindsight, gave off that strange feeling no one wanted to talk about. In the case of Rex Heuermann, the man who may have haunted Gilgo Beach for over a decade, that silence finally broke. When in his wake, he left a neighborhood, a city, and a nation wondering how close we've all come to a nightmare without even knowing it. When you hear about cases like the Gilgo Beach murders, it's easy to get lost in the darkness of the killer's story, the twists and turns of the investigation, the years of silence and pain. But what stays with me longest is the faces of those left behind, the families, friends, and communities forever changed by unimaginable loss. The ones who wake up every day carrying grief so heavy it feels like a shadow stretched across their entire lives. They are the reason this story matters, because behind every name, Melissa, Maureen, Megan, Amber, Jessica, Valerie, and the others, is a person who loved, laughed, and dreamed before the darkness came. Their families had to live through the agony of not knowing what happened for years, wondering if their daughter, sister, or mother was alive, only to have their worst fears confirmed in the most heartbreaking way possible. I've read letters written by mothers to daughters they never got to hug again, by sisters holding on to memories of late-night talks and shared secrets, by fathers who will never hear their child's voice again. These are not just stories, okay? They are lifetimes shattered, dreams stolen in silence. Many of the families faced more than just grief. They faced the crushing weight of being ignored or dismissed by those sworn to protect them. Daughters were sex workers, a fact that too often meant their disappearances didn't make the news, that police follow-ups were half-hearted, that the world looked away while they vanished. And that pain, the pain of invisibility, of being forgotten, was almost as sharp as the pain of the loss itself. But despite the overwhelming sorrow, what I find most incredible is the resilience these families have shown. They formed support groups, held vigils, and fought tirelessly to keep their daughters' memories alive. Tia, the pressed officials, demanded answers and refused to let their loved ones be reduced to just another cold case. Their voices became louder, sharper, impossible to ignore, and in many ways, they became the heartbeat of the investigation, the reason the case never truly died. The community around Gilgo Beach, once quiet and unaware, has since been forced to confront the horror that had been lurking in its shadows for so long. Parents hesitate when their children play near the dunes. Neighbors glance nervously at the brush beside the road, wondering what secrets might still be buried there. Local businesses display flyers, candles burn at memorial sites, and for years, the beach that once symbolized peace and escape has become a place of remembrance and mourning. Yet, amid this tragedy, there's a strange kind of healing, collective effort to reclaim that space from the darkness. Fundraisers, awareness campaigns, and public events have brought people together, strangers united by grief, but also by hope. Hope that someday justice will come fully, that the lost will be remembered, not just as victims, but as people, as lives that mattered. And maybe that is the hardest part to carry, knowing that this story will never truly end until every question is answered and every victim is named. But for now, the echoes remain, the empty seats at family dinners, the missing voices in phone calls that once filled the room. It's the shadows where laughter used to live. No, that's the real horror of Gilgo Beach, not the killer's identity or the gruesome nature of the crimes, but the way it stole a piece of everyone it touched, the way it reminds us how fragile life is, how easily it can be broken, how the silence that once protected the predator also trapped the victims and the families in a world where justice felt forever out of reach. So, when you think about Gilgo Beach, I want you to remember more than the mystery, more than the police failures, more than the headlines. I want you to remember the lives behind the names, the people who loved and were loved, okay? And the hope that even in the darkest places, there is light waiting to break through. Investigating a case like the Gilgo Beach murders is like trying to solve a puzzle with most of the pieces missing and the ones that remain broken, worn, or scattered across years and miles, some even deliberately hidden or destroyed. It takes patience that borders on obsession, dedication that defies exhaustion, and a willingness to stare into the darkest parts of human nature without looking away. The detectives working this case had to start with almost nothing. Plot is found in isolated marshland, wrapped in burlap sacks or plastic, with little to no forensic evidence left behind. Many of the victims were dismembered, their remains scattered between different locations, meaning the killers had planned carefully, taking their time to cover their tracks. Early on, the investigation relied on traditional methods, combing through missing persons reports, interviewing witnesses, and checking phone records. But with so many victims linked to the sex work industry, where disappearances, sadly, aren't uncommon. Connecting dots was difficult. The case spanned decades, and by the time authorities fully realized what they were facing, evidence had deteriorated, memories faded, and files were misplaced or lost. Forensic teams were brought in, working to extract DNA from decades-old samples, trying to piece together timelines from scraps of fiber, hair, and bone. This kind of analysis is slow, painstaking work, sometimes yielding breakthroughs, but often raising more questions. One body might reveal signs of strangulation, another, blunt force trauma. Others had no clear cause of death. That inconsistency made profiling the killer or killers harder, forcing investigators to consider multiple suspects or even a group acting independently but following similar patterns. Interviews became a crucial tool. Detectives tracked down friends, family members, acquaintances, and clients of the victims, hoping to uncover connections, motives, or suspicious behaviors. They reviewed logs of calls made to and from burner phones used by some victims, which led them down winding trails of dead ends and rare breakthroughs. Some witnesses were afraid to talk. Others held back details out of shame or fear. Over the years, a community of armchair detectives, journalists, and true crime enthusiasts emerged, combing through public records, satellite images, and even hike in the woods near Ocean Parkway, hoping to find what police might have missed. Their efforts sometimes frustrated law enforcement, but often provided fresh leads or renewed public interest, creating a kind of watchdog effect that kept the pressure on the official investigation. The introduction of new technologies improved DNA sequencing, geolocation tools, forensic genealogy databases eventually breathed life back into cold leads, allowing investigators to connect distant dots that had once seemed unrelated. But even with these advances, progress was slow, with every breakthrough met by a new wave of complexity. The sheer number of victims, the overlap of different missing persons cases, and the possibility of multiple perpetrators all meant that solving this case was never going to be simple or quick. The task force had to remain vigilant, sifting through mountains of data, interrogating suspects, and revisiting crime scenes that were now overgrown and changed by time. Yet, despite the frustration and setbacks, they moved forward, driven not by fame or recognition, but by a quiet determination to give the victims and their families the justice and closure they deserved. Every DNA match, every recovered phone record, every new witness statement was a small victory, a step closer to unraveling the mystery that had haunted Long Island for years. And though the road was long and winding, the slow and steady work of investigation was a testament to the resilience of those who refused to let these crimes fade into the shadows forever. It showed that even when the silence seems deafening and the darkness all-consuming, truth has a way of creeping out, piece by piece, until the puzzle finally comes together. The Gilgo Beach murders didn't just expose the horrific actions of a killer or killers. They tore back the curtain on deep-rooted societal problems that often go unnoticed, especially when it comes to those who live on the edges of society. The sex workers, the addicts, the people many prefer to ignore or judge. For years, the victims were largely invisible to the public and, tragically, to law enforcement as well. Their work, their struggles, their vulnerabilities were twisted into reasons why their disappearances might not matter as much. The stigma surrounding sex work created barriers that slowed down investigations and muted outcry. When someone is labeled a prostitute or a runaway, their humanity is too often stripped away, replaced with assumptions and indifference. Families of victims face the impossible, grieving their lost loved ones while fighting the harsh judgments of society and sometimes even the skepticism or hostility of police. Yet, over time, a shift began. As the years passed and the community rallied, voices rose up demanding change, demanding that the victims be seen for who they were, daughters, sisters, mothers, with hopes and dreams just like anyone else. Advocates and activists fought tirelessly to challenge the language used in media and official reports, pushing for respect, compassion, and acknowledgement of the systemic failures that had allowed the killer to operate for so long. Documentaries, podcasts, and social media became platforms where these conversations took place, educating people on the realities of sex, work, and the dangers of ignoring marginalized communities. This growing awareness led to broader questions about policing and justice, about how implicit bias, institutional neglect, and fear can combine to silence those who most need to be heard. Public pressure forced law enforcement agencies to reform policies, improve victim services, and train officers to treat all missing persons with the urgency and dignity they deserve. And while these changes can never undo the past, they represent a crucial step toward preventing tragedies like Gilgo Beach from happening again. The case also sparked conversations about how communities respond to violence and how neighbors and bystanders can play a role in keeping each other safe. Some questioned why no one had spoken up earlier, or why the victims weren't found sooner. But those questions often missed the complexity of fear, control, and isolation many victims experienced. The reality is that violence often hides behind closed doors and masked smiles, and it can take years, even decades, for those secrets to surface. That's why the resilience of families, advocates, and journalists has been so vital. Their courage has helped bring light to shadows that were once impenetrable, reminding us all of the importance of empathy and vigilance. And in the process, the Gilgo Beach case became more than just a mystery. It became a mirror reflecting back the challenges and failures of society, while also shining a light on the power of collective action and change. It showed that justice isn't just about catching a killer, but about valuing every human life regardless of their background or circumstance. That is the legacy of the victims, and the reason why their stories continue to resonate long after the bodies were found and the headlines faded. Because beyond the darkness, there is hope. Hope that from tragedy, awareness can grow, that from silence, voices can rise, and that from pain, progress can be made. The media's relationship with the Gilgo Beach murders has been complicated from the start, at times a tool of neglect, at others a catalyst for awareness and justice. When the first bodies were discovered along that lonely stretch of Long Island, the initial news coverage was sparse, often glossing over the identities of the victims or the gravity of the crime itself. Instead, headlines focused on lurid details, speculative theories, or portrayed the victims through a lens tinted by judgment and bias, often highlighting their work as escorts rather than their humanity. This kind of reporting did little to spur public outrage or pressure on law enforcement, and in some ways contributed to the culture of silence and dismissal that surrounded the case. Over the years, as families continued their fight for answers and advocates raised their voices, a new kind of media presence began to emerge, one that sought not just to report the facts, but to understand the people behind the headlines. Documentaries and podcasts dedicated entire series to exploring the victims' lives, the investigations, failures, and the broader social issues connected to the murders. Programs like Unraveled and independent journalists working tirelessly helped to transform public perception, humanizing the victims and putting a spotlight on the systemic problems that allowed the crimes to continue unchecked for so long. Social media also played a critical role, allowing communities to share information, raise funds for families, and organize vigils or protests demanding justice. It created a platform where stories could be told without the filter of traditional gatekeepers, amplifying voices that had been ignored for years. However, with increased media attention came new challenges. Sensational headlines and speculations sometimes sparked fear or spread misinformation, making it harder for investigators to do their work and for families to grieve privately. There were moments when the spotlight felt overwhelming, invasive, and even exploitative. Still, most victims' families and advocates recognized the power of media to keep the case alive, to force accountability, and to demand change. The shifting narrative was also reflected in how journalists approached the story, moving away from sensationalism toward empathy, from guesses toward facts, and from isolation toward community. Interviews with survivors, experts, and law enforcement officials started to appear alongside raw footage of memorials and crime scenes, painting a fuller, more nuanced picture of the case and its impact. This evolution in coverage did more than just keep the story in the public eye. It helped to shape the national conversation about missing persons, violence against women, and how society treats its most vulnerable members. It challenged viewers and readers to confront uncomfortable truths about prejudice, neglect, and injustice, and in doing so, it laid the groundwork for real change. The media became both mirror and messenger, reflecting society's failures and amplifying the calls for justice, respect, and reform. As the investigation into the Long Island serial killer advanced, so did the media's role, now less about reporting isolated incidents and more about telling an ongoing story of resilience, grief, and hope. The Gilgo Beach murders, once a whisper lost in the wind, became a beacon calling attention to the need for vigilance, compassion, and unwavering pursuit of truth. And that's a story that continues to unfold, one that reminds us all that behind every headline is a life, and behind every life, a story worth telling. For years, the Gilgo Beach murders seemed destined to remain one of the most chilling unsolved mysteries, trapped in a time before modern forensic science could fully unravel its secrets. But as technology advanced, it became clear that the tools for justice were evolving faster than the killer could adapt, offering fresh hope to a case that had been cold for so long. The first breakthroughs came from improvements in DNA testing techniques that allowed forensic scientists to extract usable genetic material from remains and evidence that once seemed too degraded or contaminated to analyze properly. It was no longer about matching DNA to known offenders, but about creating detailed genetic profiles that could be compared against massive databases of genealogical information, revealing family connections and potential suspects that were impossible to identify just a decade earlier. Digital forensics also played a critical role. Investigators could now trace phone records with unprecedented precision, track cell tower data to map suspects' movements, and examine the digital footprints left behind by both victims and perpetrators. The discovery of burner phones linked to the victims and later connected to Rex Hoyerman was a turning point that showcased how combining traditional detective work with digital expertise could crack a case wide open. Forensic genealogy, the process of using public DNA databases to identify unknown individuals, became a game changer, allowing detectives to piece together family trees and zero in on suspects, the relatives who had voluntarily submitted their DNA to ancestry services. This approach not only identified Rex as a suspect, but also connected other pieces of evidence that had baffled investigators for years. But technology alone wasn't enough. It required skilled investigators, forensic experts, and patient collaboration across multiple agencies and jurisdictions to make sense of the data. It was a slow process, full of setbacks and dead ends, but the persistence paid off, transforming what once felt like a hopeless cold case into a story of progress and possibility. The use of technology also highlighted the importance of preserving evidence carefully, reminding law enforcement agencies everywhere that even the smallest sample could become a vital clue with the right tools and expertise. In many ways, the Gilgo Beach investigation became a blueprint for how to apply modern science to solve old crimes, showing the power of combining new techniques with dogged determination and community involvement. It also raised important questions about privacy, consent, and the balance between using technology to catch criminals and protecting individuals' rights. Yet, despite those concerns, the overwhelming consensus was that without these advancements, the Gilgo Beach case might never have moved forward, and the killer might still be free. This chapter in the investigation was a turning point, a moment when science, technology, and humanity came together to seek justice for those whose voices have been silenced for too long. And while the road ahead remains uncertain and many questions still linger, the promise of technology brings with it hope that one day all the mysteries of Gilgo Beach will finally be laid to rest, and the victims will be remembered not just for how they died, but for who they were in life. The Gilgo Beach murders exposed not only the darkness of one man's crimes, but also the cracks and challenges within law enforcement agencies that struggled to piece together the truth over many years, highlighting a mix of human error, resource limitations, and systemic issues that often hindered timely investigations. Early in the case, communication between Suffolk County Police, Nassau County authorities, and the FBI was fragmented, with jurisdictional battles and confusion about who was responsible for leads and follow-ups, creating gaps that allowed the killer to operate with a disturbing level of freedom. Investigators faced overwhelming caseloads and limited funding, compounded by the difficult realities of investigating cases involving marginalized populations like sex workers. Disappearances frequently received less attention and urgency due to biases and misconceptions. Some officers expressed frustration with outdated protocols and the absence of modern forensic tools, feeling hampered in their ability to pursue leads aggressively or connect the dots between seemingly unrelated disappearances and deaths. Public criticism of the police's handling of the case intensified as families and advocates demanded answers, shining a harsh light on failures to communicate with loved ones and to treat victims with dignity and respect. These criticisms spurred reforms aimed at improving cooperation between agencies, increasing training on bias and victim advocacy, and investing in better technology and resources dedicated to cold cases and missing persons investigations. New task forces were formed, combining the expertise of multiple departments and specialists to ensure more coordinated and focused efforts. The Gilgo Beach case became a catalyst for broader changes in law enforcement practices across New York and beyond, emphasizing the need for transparency, accountability, and sensitivity when dealing with vulnerable communities. Yet, the emotional toll on officers working the case was profound. Many described the weight of knowing they were chasing a monster who had evaded justice for so long, carrying the burden of families' pain alongside the relentless pressure to find answers. Tennessee's, the challenges of balancing public scrutiny, legal constraints, and the complexity of forensic science made it a difficult path, but one marked by dedication and an unyielding commitment to justice. This ongoing effort reminds us that law enforcement is made up of individuals grappling with difficult realities, learning from past mistakes, and striving to protect communities better in the future. The Gilgo Beach investigation, with all its hardships and heartbreak, stands as a reminder of the importance of vigilance, continual improvement, and empathy within policing. Reminder that behind every badge is a human being trying to make a difference in a world often shadowed by tragedy. As reforms take hold and new technologies emerge, the hope remains that future cases will be solved more swiftly and compassionately, honoring the memories of victims and restoring faith in the justice system. The story of Gilgo Beach is far from over, but the lessons it has taught are already shaping the way law enforcement responds to the darkest corners of human experience, guiding a future where silence no longer protects the guilty and every voice is heard. Despite the breakthroughs and arrests, the Gilgo Beach murders remain shrouded in mystery, with a host of questions that continue to haunt investigators, families, and the community, serving as a chilling reminder that not every secret has been uncovered and not every truth has been spoken. from the very beginning. The sprawling nature of the case, with bodies scattered over miles of isolated coastline and victims whose lives intersected in complicated, sometimes unknown ways, created a labyrinth of uncertainty that investigators have yet to fully navigate, leaving many wondering if all the victims have truly been found, or if more remain hidden beneath the dunes and marshes. Silent and forgotten, their stories never told, their names never spoken aloud. The possibility of additional perpetrators also lingers, as some experts speculate that more than one individual may have exploited the same vulnerable population over the years, using similar methods to conceal their crimes, complicating the already complex investigation and fueling debates about whether the long timeline of murders could be linked to a network of offenders or copycats rather than a single man. The motivations behind the killer's actions, his choice of victims, and the chilling phone calls to families add layers of psychological puzzles that remain only partially solved, leaving investigators to piece together fragmented motives from behavior patterns and digital breadcrumbs. The true scope of the killer's crimes might never be fully known, and families continue to search for closure, caught in the limbo between justice achieved and justice still out of reach. New tips, cold leads, and technological advancements occasionally reignite hopes of uncovering fresh evidence or identifying unknown victims. Yet, the case's passage of time means that memories fade, evidence degrades, and witnesses become harder to find, all making resolution increasingly difficult. The community around Gilgo Beach still grapples with the sense of vulnerability that the case exposed, knowing that such horrors can unfold in places that once felt safe and familiar, reminding us all of the fragility of safety and the hidden dangers that can lurk in the most ordinary places. As the years pass, the story of Gilgo Beach serves as a stark warning about the cost of silence and the vital importance of vigilance, empathy, and justice in the face of evil. While the arrest of Rex Hoyerman marked a major turning point, it did not close the book on the case, and the echoes of the past continue to reverberate through the lives of those touched by the tragedy, compelling all of us to ask difficult questions, seek deeper understanding, and hold on to the hope that someday all mysteries will be solved, all victims will be found, and all families will finally find the peace they deserve. In the wake of the Gilgo Beach murders, a community once fractured by fear and sorrow has slowly begun to heal, finding strength in unity, remembrance, and resilience, a healing process that speaks not only to the power of collective mourning, but also to the human spirit's remarkable capacity to reclaim hope in the darkest of times. Families of victims, survivors, neighbors, and activists have come together to create memorials, conize vigils, and establish support networks that serve both as tributes to those lost and as reminders that their lives, while cut tragically short, continue to matter and inspire change. These memorial sites, some modest, flowers and photos laid carefully beneath weathered trees. Others, more formal, with plaques and benches, offer places where loved ones and community members can gather, share stories, and find solace amid grief that never fully fades, but gradually transforms into a shared commitment to honor the memories of those taken too soon. Local organizations have worked tirelessly to raise awareness about violence against women and the vulnerabilities of marginalized populations, turning tragedy into activism that seeks to prevent future horrors by advocating for better protections, improved law enforcement response, and greater public education. The Gilgo Beach case has become a symbol of resilience, a stark reminder that communities can and must support each other through crisis and recovery, and that healing is a journey taken not alone, but together. Neighbors who once looked away now keep watch, volunteering in local initiatives aimed at safety and outreach, determined that the darkness which once cloaked their streets will never return. Even amidst lingering pain and unanswered questions. The community spirit has not been broken, but forged anew, bound by a shared history that demands remembrance, justice, and hope. This ongoing healing reflects the deep human need for connection and meaning, especially after trauma, proving that from even the most devastating losses, there can emerge growth, understanding, and an unwavering dedication to making the world safer for all. And as the years pass, the memory of Gilgo Beach's victims will live, not just in the shadows of the past, but in the light of the community's resilience, serving as a beacon of compassion and courage that guides future generations toward empathy, awareness, and justice. The Gilgo Beach murders were not just a local tragedy. They became a national wake-up call that forced the United States to confront uncomfortable truths about how missing persons cases, especially those involving marginalized women, are handled, exposing systemic flaws and sparking conversations that reverberated far beyond Long Island's shores. For years, the victims' disappearances were overlooked or minimized because of their backgrounds, a painful reality that reflected widespread biases and institutional failures deeply embedded within law enforcement agencies and society at large. This case shattered the illusion that violence of this scale only happened somewhere else and highlighted the urgent need for reform in how missing persons reports are prioritized, how victims are treated, and how resources are allocated. Lawmakers, activists, and advocacy groups seized upon the Gilgo Beach story to push for stronger legislation aimed at protecting vulnerable populations, improving interagency communication, and enhancing databases that track missing persons and unidentified remains. The case also fueled efforts to educate the public in law enforcement about the dangers faced by sex workers and the importance of viewing them as individuals deserving of dignity and protection, not stigma or neglect. Media coverage shifted toward more compassionate storytelling, shining a light on victims' lives rather than just the gruesome details of their deaths, fostering empathy and understanding across communities. Nationally, Gilgo Beach inspired the creation of task forces dedicated to cold cases and unsolved murders, promoting collaboration between local police, federal agencies, and forensic scientists to apply new technologies and best practices. It also encouraged increased funding for support services for families of missing persons, recognizing the vital role they play in keeping cases alive and advocating for justice. Beyond legislation and policy, the case awakened a cultural reckoning about the way society views violence against women and the importance of listening to those who have historically been silenced. Gilgo Beach became a stark reminder that behind every missing person is a human being with a story worth hearing, family yearning for answers, and a community demanding action. And while the road to change is ongoing and imperfect, the legacy of Gilgo Beach continues to inspire reform, resilience, and renewed vigilance across the nation, making sure that the shadows that once hid this killer are now illuminated with truth, respect, and an unwavering commitment to justice for all. As the story of the Gilgo Beach murders draws to a close, it is vital to remember that beyond the chilling headlines and the haunting mystery lies a deeply human tale of lives cut short, its families forever changed, and the community's painful journey toward healing and justice. These victims' women who faced hardships and vulnerabilities deserve to be remembered, not as mere statistics or sensational news, but as individuals with dreams, laughter, and love, whose absence leaves a permanent void in the hearts of those who knew them. The long shadow cast by the killer's actions has transformed into a beacon of awareness and change, reminding us all of the importance of compassion, vigilance, and the relentless pursuit of truth. Their stories have sparked vital conversations about how society treats its most vulnerable members and have challenged the stigma and silence that, too, often surround victims of violence. While the arrest and prosecution of Rex Hoyerman mark a significant milestone, the journey toward full closure is ongoing as families and communities continue to seek answers, justice, and peace. The legacy of Gilgo Beach extends beyond the tragedy, is a testament to the power of resilience, the importance of advocacy, and the enduring human spirit that refuses to be silenced. It calls on all of us to listen more carefully, to protect more fiercely, and to remember that every life matters, no matter how hidden or overlooked it may have seemed. As we reflect on this dark chapter, we must also look forward with hope, supporting efforts to improve how missing persons and victims of violence are treated, and ensuring that no one's disappearance is ever dismissed or forgotten again. Gilgo Beach case is a haunting reminder that evil can lurk in the most ordinary places. But it also shows that courage, love, and justice have the power to bring light into even the darkest corners. So tonight, as you close your eyes, remember the victims not for how their stories ended, but for the lives they lived and the hope their memories inspire, a hope that one day healing will be complete and justice will truly be served.